So every few years, I teach John Milton's Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is an epic poem written by John Milton in the middle to late 1600s. It's one of the most, if not the most influential poem in the English language. It's a poem about God, it's about Adam and Eve, it tells the story of Lucifer's fall from heaven and subsequent damnation, and it tells the story of Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So Milton writes this poem about humanity's fall from grace, and he asks this question about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and the tree of knowledge, and is this whole thing fair? Does it make sense that God gave us paradise but included this tree that works like a self-destruct button? And if we eat the tree, we lose everything, and God knows? He knows with absolute certainty that we're gonna do it. Is that fair? Can we call such a God good? So I want to try and figure this out. Milton's speaker early in the poem claims that he is trying to justify the ways of God to us, but does he do that? And I think the stakes here are pretty high because Milton is arguing, as a Christian poet, he's arguing that we ought to take the Christian account of the universe very seriously. And part of that whole account is that the universe, on the whole, is just, that God is good, that God has a plan, that his plan will unfold through time, and its outcome will ultimately be just and good because God is just and good. Milton wants us to take that vision of the universe seriously. So not only is there a God, but we owe that God our obedience and gratitude, and certainly not our resentment and scorn and whatever other problematic feelings many of us might have about the Christian God. People get really worked up about God. And what I think is so funny about this poem is that Milton sets out to say, look, I'm going to demonstrate to you that God is actually good. And then he gives us the least likable God in all of literature. And in some ways, I think the proposition is, if you don't like God, that's a you problem, not a God problem, which you just kind of have to respect as a hilarious rhetorical strategy. So here, in Milton's account, is what God is responsible for. God created us and made us free. We are free to fall or not to fall. God also created Satan, who attempted to mount a revolution in heaven and was therefore cast out and into hell. Already this seems like a problem, right? Because how does the perfect, all-good, all-knowing God so badly screw up angelic psychology that a third of his angels want to overthrow him? And part of the reason the angels revolt is because they feel, or Satan has persuaded them, that they live under some kind of divine tyranny. Nobody elected God. The angels didn't sign on to any kind of social contract making him the absolute ruler of the universe, who died and made this deity king of heaven. To understand this, it's helpful, I think, to know something about the political context in which this poem was written. See, at this point in English history, concepts like the divine right of kings, the absolute power of the monarchy, those were under a lot of pressure. There were widespread philosophical and political discussions about political legitimacy. What makes a king or a government legitimate? Where does their power and authority come from? Does it come from nature? Does it come from God? Does it come from tradition? Does it come from the people? Is it purely a matter of might makes right? Do people who have the most power and the most money get to rule? In the decades before Milton wrote Paradise Lost, people in England were demanding a more representative form of government. And this culminated dramatically in an English civil war. It would take about 100 years before the American and French revolutions ushered modern forms of democracy into world history. But in the middle of the 17th century, the 1600s, England actually briefly became a republic. The King Charles I was overthrown, he was eventually executed, and England temporarily had a Republican government. And here's the curious thing. Milton was actually on the Republican side. He actually worked for the Republican government. So we know from his biography that Milton was sympathetic to Republican causes and opposed to tyrannical monarchs. So when we hear Satan speak in the voice of a Republican revolutionary about overthrowing an unjust monarch, should we sympathize with him? Is he accurately representing God's tyrannical government of the universe? And another thing, if God can't convince the angels to be loyal to him, they literally live in heaven. How are humans supposed to feel? Humans in the garden are given everything they need, but they gotta work all the time. They gotta go out and labor in the garden every day. Eve doesn't get to choose her husband. She's just handed some guy. And does this God hate knowledge? You're not supposed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why is knowledge bad? Does he want us stupid and enslaved? Hold on, I'm getting a call here. Hello? Hey, it's me. Hi. Do you ever notice when we're reading the poem how quickly our objections start to sound like Satan's objections? Yeah, but like how quickly we start saying things are unfair and unjust. Like God gave us life and gave us paradise, and we just keep saying like, yeah, but why didn't he give us all this other stuff? Yeah, but what about the knowledge thing? Like, why is knowledge forbidden? Even Satan understands this. Knowledge forbidden? Suspicious. Reasonless. Why should their Lord envy them that? Yeah, that's a little tricky. But let me just play devil's advocate for a second here. You see what I did there? Yeah. Because I'm advocating for God. Yeah, I got it. It's pretty clever. Not that clever. So let's think about knowledge. Do you want to know what it's like to hunt people for sport? Like, that's a kind of knowledge you could have. Like, do you need to hunt people for sport to know that it's bad? Like, do you need to punch a baby in the face to know that punching babies in their chubby baby faces is a bad thing to do? And animal testing. We could learn lots of things about nature and the natural world, I imagine, if we dissected live dolphins, or if we, put chimpanzees under severe stress to see what it did to their brains. Or why stop at animals? We could just round up a bunch of people we don't like and do a bunch of experiments on them. That's a kind of knowledge we could have. But that would be bad. So knowledge isn't simply good. Some knowledge maybe should be prohibited. Okay. Also, the tree isn't a trap. The tree makes you free. If there was no tree in the garden, there would be no possibility for disobedience, and then we would just be slave-like automatons. God talks about this in Book 3 of the poem. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given, sincere, of true allegiance, constant faith, or love? Okay, fair, but you have to admit that Milton's God is like a jerk. Like, why is he so unlikable? Yeah, I think it's partly because Milton's depicting the Trinity, right? This is a three-person God, and this is God the Father. He's judgmental and stern. When you look at what God the Son wants to do and what Satan wants to do, I think the distinction between good and evil becomes pretty clear, right? Satan wants to come up from hell to bring humanity down there with him, and the Son wants to descend from heaven to bring humanity up with him. I think Milton is really trying to emphasize the heroic character of Jesus in the Christian tradition, right? This is a new account of what heroism is. Yeah, but he knows. See, here's the thing. In this poem, the Son knows that he's not gonna die when he goes to earth. So can we really call his actions heroic? Like, if you know that after you die, you're going to come back to be the king of heaven, is it really a sacrifice? Yeah. Okay, well, I gotta go. Wait, come on. In fairness, it is true that our criticisms of Milton's God often sound exactly like Satan's criticisms of God. And I think that is part of the genius of this poem. Milton creates almost this interpretive trap where, as we start to read and get exercised and angry about what's going on, we start to critique God, and then all of a sudden we're siding with the devil. It might be helpful to ask yourself, what would be enough? God has given humanity paradise, given humanity freedom, given humanity existence, life itself. When would we be satisfied? And I think there Milton might be making a point about our human disposition more generally. Are we typically grateful for the things we have, or are we characteristically resentful and envious and desirous of more and more and more? Milton's poem might be, in part, designed to illustrate this characteristic human ingratitude. We are much more inclined to think and talk about the things we don't have than appreciate the things we've been given. But that doesn't solve all the problems in this poem. What about the representation of gender here? Eve is perhaps the most important and problematic figure in this poem. And so if you really want to understand Paradise Lost, you should take a look at this video over here. I'll see you there. Talk to you soon.